I'm Alex with Kodiak Woodcraft. In this video, we're going to be building this pint-sized workbench. Now, I built this for my daughter. She's been spending all kinds of time in the woodshop with me. She's extremely interested, so it felt like a great time to build this. I looked at a couple of different plans online for kids-sized benches, and I decided to come up with my own because I had a few special considerations. First, I really wanted to make this with a real wood top. Now, we've all done the plywood top thing. I did that for my own bench here, which is a story for another day. But I really wanted to make this last, so I built this top out of pine. I'll show you a little bit about that in a moment. Second, I wanted to make the bench small enough to where I could tuck it under my main workbench. I didn't really want this to be a permanent fixture at any one spot. I just want to be able to tuck it out of the way when she's not using it. Finally, I had a special consideration for this shelf, which is primarily going to be used to hold my daughter's rock tumbler. Alright, let's get to building.
The first part of this build was to create the bench top. As I just mentioned, I built it by laminating a bunch of individual pine boards together. Now, the lumber that I used was of your typical big box store variety, so even though I picked the best of their stock, it still had a little bit of cupping and twisting going on. I had some concern about these imperfections magnifying themselves, so instead of doing one massive glue up, I built the top in stages. This would allow me to square up each of the sub glue ups before attacking the full-sized tabletop. Anyhow, what you're seeing here is one of those first stage glue ups. I essentially did this part 4 times. I managed to pick the worst one to film because I went a little too light on the glue here. I don't think I starved the joints, but I did get better squeeze out the other 3 times around. After each of my sub glue ups dried, I ran them through my planer to square them up and to get them to a consistent thickness. I don't have a joiner in my shop, but I have lots of workarounds for that. In this case, I used a simple joining sled to achieve a similar outcome to a joiner. I'll talk more about that sled in a moment. Once I had at least one relatively flat surface on each of the glue ups, I ditched the sled and brought the 4 sub pieces to consistent thickness. At this point, I felt much better about that large scale glue up. I repeated the process for the second stage. I used plenty of glue here, probably compensating for the last time around, and I used a bunch of clamps to really bear down on the workpiece. Just like I had done earlier, I left the glue to set overnight and came back for it the next day. At this point, it was time for another trip to the planer. As you may have guessed by now, I had been very careful to build the top to the exact depth or width as my planer, just under 13 inches. If I had chosen to build a bigger bench, I would have flattened it with a hand plane or with my router-based joining jig. I wanted to keep this simple and make future repairs really easy, so 13 inches made lots of sense. I told you I'd share a little bit more about this joining sled. This is probably the most bare-boned joining sled that you could use, but it does do the trick. The basic idea is that if you attach your workpiece to the sled and you use shims so that it doesn't rock or flex, it's basically as if the bottom of your workpiece is flat, as if it's already been jointed and planed. When you run it through the planer, it replicates that flat top on the other side. Without the sled, all the little glue bumps and everything else would influence the planer's ability to truly flatten the top. Basically, I used the jig for a few passes, and then once I had that flat top, I stopped using it. In my case, it does make planer snipe a bit harder to control, so once I have a flat enough surface, I tend to flip over the workpiece a few times without using the jig to finish the job. Once I had completed my efforts at the planer, I took a few minutes to square up the bench top. I started at the table saw, and then I cut the ends off at my miter saw. Again, I was really pushing the limits of my equipment here. This project was a great reminder that I desperately need to build a new table saw sled. I had a great one, it was extremely accurate, but it's been retired and I need to build a new one. That will be a video for another day, so make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss it. Alright, so this is where the benchtop project became pretty fun. I knew I wanted to give this bench a special touch, so I decided to route my daughter's name into the front. I just so happened to have this sign making jig. I had picked it up when I was new into woodworking, and it was really great to have a use for it now. Also, I'm not sure why I waited until this point in the project to do this. It would have been less risky to tackle this pre-glue up. In any case, I went for it, I took my shot, and I'd say the lettering came out pretty well. It's not perfect, but I'm still glad I did it. Now, to make the lettering stand out, I used primer and paint. Take your lesson from me, you don't want to just spray like I did here without masking anything off. I guess I just hadn't sanded paint in a while, but it took a lot more effort to remove than I had expected. It's not that it took long, but it gummed up my sanding discs and sandpaper, which was sort of wasteful. Anyway, my lesson was learned, and I did end up with a really nice result in the end. Once I finished the lettering, I routed a round over profile on the top and the bottom of the bench. It ended up feeling nice to the touch and really completed that top. This was starting to feel like a big cutting board at this point. The very last step on this bench top was just to do a little bit of sanding to knock out any minor imperfections from the planer blades, saw blades, and the router. It all came together nicely, and the bench top was a success. It was time to move on to the base. Now, I built this base using Baltic birch plywood. I actually cut up an older abandoned project to get the stock for this. If I were to buy fresh, I would have used something a little more utilitarian. That lumber supply chain is no joke right now. I cut down all of my parts in advance, which is what you're seeing here. Rather than trying to explain or show each and every piece or where the screw holes go, I'll highlight the main stages of the base build so that you can customize for your own design. The one thing that I will say is that, as always, I was very careful about measuring and pre-drilling holes. I also used a larger drill bit to create countersink pockets for all of the screws. You may notice later in the video at one point that I made a bit of an absent-minded mistake. I pre-drilled into one of the workpieces that I would be drilling into. Fortunately, because I had measured so meticulously, it all ended up aligning anyway. The one thing that I do want to call out here has to do with the two pieces that actually connect the base to the tabletop. I drilled a couple of holes vertically through these pieces so that I could later run screws through them. I was very careful to keep that pre-drilling straight and precise. I assembled my stand from the middle out. Basically, I built the shelf first. The shelf was very important because it helped add rigidity to the bench. It also lowered the center of gravity, and it also held that rock tumbler I was telling you about. My daughter is pretty into that rock tumbler, so I had to make sure it felt at home. After the shelf was assembled, I attached the legs. The main concern here was to simply make sure that they were parallel and straight. Although the length was actually quite precise, it wasn't the most important thing here. I would later add feet to the legs, and those feet are what would actually make contact with the ground. After I had all four legs attached, I moved the assembly to my drill press table because it's one of the most trustworthy surfaces in my shop when it comes to its flatness. I'll remind you that my workbench has a plywood top, regrettably, and it's not super flat. This was a bit of an awkward place to try to film, but you can see here that I'm attaching those feet to the legs. Actually, I'm not sure if I should be calling these feet in the first place, so forgive me if there's a better term. Once I had completed this step on the bottom of the base, I flipped it over and did the exact same thing on the top half of the base. These are the pieces that actually make to the top, and like I mentioned earlier, I had done some deep countersinking here so that I'd be able to screw the base and the top together. This was essentially it for the base. With the exception of one cross-running board that I didn't film, the base was done. I measured for center and attached the base to the bench top with 6 long screws. Things got interesting with the center screws. There wasn't a lot of room to operate. I broke out one of the more obscure tools in my shop for this. It's this pressure-driven compact driver. I almost never use this, but when I do, I'm always glad to have it handy.
Alright, that's the project. I hope you enjoyed it. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss my next video.